Snorlax is our sacrifice. Why is this so...
February?
I'm gonna sit on Snorlax. Hi, I had probably the hardest day in a long time. Everything went wrong. If you know, you know. The beautiful little strawberry rose mocha to make up for it. Nisha. Today, we will be discussing the house of my mother. I knew about this story before the book came out because if you haven't heard of it, it's a high profile story. So a lot of people probably already know about the sentencing and the crimes that occurred. If you didn't hear about the 8 passengers bloggers before they were arrested, because they were big before the arrest. But I bought the book when it came out and I actually gave it away. I'm like, yeah, read it. So The House of My Mother is written by Shari Franke. Let's just get started. The intro starts with Shari in college. She's studying, thinking about her family. She hadn't seen them in a year. And her neighbor calls and says, Shari, the police are at your house. So Shari races over and all she can think of is, oh my gosh, my siblings are dead. But when she arrives, the police stop her and then she's like, this is my house. And so they ask her what the layout of the house is. Shari posts to Instagram a story that says, finally. And then we have the first chapter. Charlie is loafing on the PlayStation 4 and you cannot see him, but he is adorable. So the Franke family are a family of 8 in Utah that were famous online as the 8 Passengers Family Vlog channel. It was ran by the mother, Ruby Franke, and her husband Kevin, mainly Ruby though. And their children are part of the Latter-day Saints community and religion. And if you didn't know, in 2023, Ruby Franke and her partner Jodi Hildebrandt were arrested on charges of child abuse. Unfortunately, most of this could have been prevented if Child Protective Services took the complaint seriously, not just the complaints about Ruby Franke's family, but also Jodi Hildebrandt's family. Unfortunately, Jodi Hildebrandt's nibbling Jessie shared their story of abuse from Jodi Hildebrandt, and wow, that was awful. And I know that it was a lot on Jessie when they were talking about it and giving interviews, and that they really didn't want to speak about it because they went through a lot of therapy trying to heal from Jodi. I am glad that they shared their story, and it's just so sad that it started with Jodi, but also ran parallel with Franke, and then Jodi exacerbated it. We'll get into it, okay? So it could have been prevented. And if people listened when Jodi's other victims spoke out, because Jodi had a lot of victims. One thing's for sure, these children did not deserve to be abused. No one deserves to be abused. But they also didn't deserve to have their abuse broadcasted for millions to watch. This is the story of Shari Franke and her survival in the Franke family. Out of respect for their privacy, I'll be doing what Shari's doing. In her memoir, she doesn't name her younger siblings that were the victims of the child abuse charges. I won't be naming her younger siblings. Chad is her other sibling. He's the oldest after Shari. And I will be mentioning Chad because he's an adult now, and that's also what Shari did in her memoir, so I'm just going to follow what she does there. First off, I heard how other people were talking about it's obvious that Shari had a ghostwriter because the book is so well written. And I agree, it is written in a very engaging way. I've only really read one memoir, I think. No, I've read 2 memoirs. I read Lily Collins' memoir when I was a teenager, which really resonated with me. And then I also read I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. And that one, I was like, whoa. I immediately told Kyle all about it. I was like, this is all that happens. This one was really engaging, and the edit, Shari gives it to Caroline Ryder, her writing collaborator, in the author's note in the back. And I looked at Caroline Ryder's profile online, and I'm really impressed. Looks like Caroline's doing some great things. Jeanette McCurdy's memoir was very emotional and another nod to abuse of children, especially in the entertainment and content industry. I know we know mostly about Dan Schneider's abuse and Nickelodeon's terrible treatment of child actors. Shari Franke is speaking out against children in the content industry, and she's speaking out against it both in her memoir and in court, and I believe that is the right thing to do, and I'm so glad that she's doing that. This is a time in history, I think, that we're finally seeing people who were broadcast as children online. What sent Ruby and Jodi to jail? Ruby's youngest son showed up to Jodi's neighbor's house malnourished and with serious injuries, asking for a favor, showing signs of being held with duct tape, and he had escaped through a window of Jodi Hildebrandt's house, went to the neighbors for help, and the neighbors called the police. This led to the arrest of Jodi and the discovery of another child at the home, alone and in terrible emotional condition. These kids have really went through a lot of emotional and psychological trauma in addition to their physical abuse. Yeah, there was a safe door in the basement of the home where the kids were forced to clean and sit and be punished. And I mean, it's all documented in, not all of it, but a big portion of it is actually documented in Ruby Franke's journal, which is just so horrid. And that's not all, but I don't want to get into that so much as I want to share Shari's story because it is really powerful and these kids have went through a lot. So, Ruby Franke was Ruby Griffith's before marriage. She was from a generational family of Latter-day Saints, so she grew up with a lot of siblings and a lot of religious rules. She took care of a lot of them, embracing responsibility and caregiving, since Utah is a very Latter-day Saints community. Ruby apparently didn't have a strong relationship with her mother. If anything, her mother was cold and distant, and all of Ruby's dreams really became about being a mother herself, where she would be seen for and recognized for her help in bringing a child into the world, which is seen as like a godly creation in this community, and gain respect for herself and from her mother and those around her, because it seemed like the only way that she could gain respect from her mother is becoming a mother herself. She immediately went to college for accounting. She went only for the sole purpose of finding a husband, and that she did. She had a specific list of what she wanted, and she found that he needed to be an engineering major, like her dad, a member of the LDS Church, tall and handsome, and she found that in Kevin Franke. She was really trying. She was going out of her way to flirt with everybody. And Kevin Franke was 4 years older. He had a civil engineering degree. Well, he was about to have one. He was about to graduate. He was the youngest of 7 children. He was part of the LDS Church, taller than Ruby, and he was attractive. So he was perfect. And it said that he was holding hands with Ruby while they were watching a movie, and she was also holding hands with the guy to the left of her under a blanket, so very secretive. And he told her straight up he did not like that. And that was what made Ruby want to be with him. She was like, oh, you stood your ground, you know what you want. Within 2 weeks, she asked him, are you gonna propose to me? And he's like, oh crap, I guess I am. 3 months later, they were married. Very quickly, she gave birth to her firstborn, who is Shari. And Shari's earliest memories, ironically, were of Ruby always crying about something, which is so ironic because Ruby didn't believe that children should cry, but she was also crying constantly herself. Shari was having a lot of health problems at first, and Kevin really took her health seriously and was worried for her. They originally diagnosed Shari with colic, and Kevin felt like that wasn't the only thing wrong, so he single-handedly saved Shari's life, according to her memoir. She would have died because of an intestinal issue if he hadn't stepped in. So already, we're seeing more concern over Shari's well-being from her father than her mother. And I say that because there will literally be so many more moments where Kevin is the one showing the concern for Shari's well-being or their connection in comparison to Ruby. I know a lot of people critique Kevin for abandoning his kids. If you didn't know, he abandons his kids later. It was kind of a direct command from Ruby for him to isolate himself. But Shari does state in here several times where Kevin feels more emotionally available than Ruby, even though he does ultimately need to take accountability for his actions in the case and for leaving them at a time when they needed him. So Shari is the oldest child, but soon enough she has 5 younger siblings. So I think she has 3 younger sisters and 2 younger brothers. Chad is the next born, and he grows up kind of be the opposite of Shari, where Shari keeps her emotions and feels like she cannot share them. Chad is kind of like all over the place with energy and really pulls pranks and very kind of like outgoing, outward. Shari states that as she grows up, her mother is cold and distant to her, kind of like how Shari's mother was to her. Ruby always had the mindset that crying children did not in fact need to cry, nor be coddled. Really, they should be responsible and learn at an early age to be self-sufficient, which I am not someone who is on the family vlogging, family type of content, but out of the small amounts that I do see on my feed, I have seen these people making their children pack their lunches at like age 5. And if they don't pack their lunch, then they go hungry. And it's so crazy to me that this is just a reflection of like all of these other channels of these people doing this, and they don't see that that's wrong. Pack your kids' lunch. Let them eat, bro. Anyway, from this isolated emotional state, Shari learns that sharing her emotions is rewarded with insults and more isolation, and that she needs to keep her real feelings to herself and do whatever is necessary to make Ruby happy. Because if Ruby's not happy, she is yelling. And that is what Shari remembers most about her early childhood, is Ruby always yelling. Started mainly with piano, something she was natural at in her childhood and studied for a long time, so she had Shari start learning piano. Shari did not share this love for piano and would be woken up at 5 a.m. to practice and would feel so controlled and fearful of her mother, especially in these piano lessons. She would even lay awake at night imagining demons in her room and also having stomach pain at a young age, only later realizing that it was anxiety symptoms. And she had shared this with Ruby when she was a child, and she didn't address these concerns at all. Didn't even care that her child had a stomach ache. Ruby literally told her that she was like making this up. Like, there's nothing wrong with you, Shari, get over it. Some quick facts. Shari quickly gave the children contributions that they had to give for, I guess, existing. They would be told to clean. Once the ball was rolling with this YouTube vlogging, they moved into a new home. Ruby painted all the walls yellow, had several miscarriages, and never gave herself the time to grieve, according to Shari. And then gave Shari the talk at age 8, where she was struggling with the disturbing information because she couldn't really reconcile the talk with the religious ideology that she had learned. And she's 8 years old. She viewed it kind of as a clinical detachment. It's a source of trauma for a lot of Christian followers, so, you know, it's hard to reconcile. Shari actually shares that the widow of Nauvoo... Oh, Siri thinks I'm talking to her. Shari shares that the widow of Nauvoo was an early ancestor on her mother's side, apparently during the LDS persecution in the 1840s. This widow was a source of inspiration for Shari. She references her sometimes when she feels like she needs to draw inspiration. She kind of pictures herself and her ancestors, and I think that was like a really personal touch to this memoir, is you kind of see the strength in Shari and like where she draws her strength from in times where she can't be supported by her family. Ruby was always angry with everyone yelling a lot. She would smack them on the face. Ruby would often like smack at least Shari on the face, like on the mouth, leave bruises, and so Shari reasonably became angry of making Ruby upset. The children would wake up at 6 a.m., practice piano, violin, or harp, pack their own school lunches, which they were forced to do if they wanted to eat food. If you haven't seen the viral video of Ruby talking about how she was called from a teacher at the school concerned because one of her daughters didn't get fed lunch, and then she's just arrogantly talking about how, of course my child should have made her own lunch. I'm not gonna drive to the school just to give her a lunch. And oh my god, it's so hard to watch. I'm not even a mother, and this is disturbing. Anyway, so they would pack their own lunch. They were forced to walk to school or ride the bus depending, because they all kind of went to separate schools because they had separate ages. And Ruby would only drive them to school on their birthday, or pick them up on their birthday. Shari was brought to Kevin and Ruby one night and told she wasn't very fun to be around and seemed to annoy others on purpose. If my parents were to tell me that as a child, when I'm just holding in all of my emotions to placate people around me, I don't even know how I would process that as a child. This is like insane. Shari shares in her journal entry that it's probably because she didn't like being around them, and that her mom promises not to yell during piano practice, but then does. And so Shari ends up finding solace in books, and very soon her life was to change in more ways than one. Their family view on the blog came partly because of the LDS encouragement of journaling, of documenting your family for future generations to read, and probably from her sister, Ruby's sister's YouTube channels. Ruby started with blogs about cooking and documenting her children's lives, but when she saw that her sisters made money from YouTube, she thought, why don't I try that? So she starts a channel. Shari believes this is from Ruby's desire to be respected and coveted. She wanted recognition for her godly deeds. That for her was her good parenting style, no matter how strict it may seem. Unfortunately, this meant that the abuse that Shari was experiencing was also translated on screen, but in lesser effect. With millions of people seeing a perfect LDS family that was in fact imperfect, Ruby was yelling when the cameras were off. She would expose her vulnerable children in gross ways to make money and also present herself as the perfect mom simultaneously. This became embarrassing for Shari, who was going through a period of puberty, a period of learning her own personality and expression, giving in to her mother's whims, despite how embarrassing they may be. So really, it became a way to have privileges she normally wouldn't get, like being able to see friends or buy ice cream. Normal kid stuff she would have to barter for videos. The incentive was always for film content and more money. Ruby was really hard on Chad for his energetic personality, punishing him by shaving his head in a reverse mohawk when he cut Shari's hair as a joke. And Shari, of course, was hurt because he cut her hair, but then she was more concerned over how Chad was going to be punished. Ironically, Ruby was able to film Shari and her waxing Shari's eyebrow off, despite the fact that it took cajoling for Shari to even agree. Okay, yeah, you can wax my eyebrows. She straight up waxes one of her eyebrows off and laughs about it and films it online with the title oh my god, I'm so sorry. And then Shari has to go to school with sunglasses on and pretend that she isn't walking around with half just put yourself in the mentality of middle school or high school. Having an eyebrow, a pimple is bad enough, but missing your entire eyebrow as your mom, who you should trust to be able to be around your eyebrows. Ruby said that she would give her $100 for it, and Shari doesn't remember getting the $100 anyway. So Shari decides to start her own YouTube channel at 14, but she isn't even given full control over it. Ruby would make the money from this channel as well, is really hitting it off, and she was making money from 8 passengers. Shari had to have permission for anything that she posted on social media. So instead of having her own avenue where she could have some control over it, she still had to get permission from her mom. So while all of this is happening, the Franke family trades their car for an 8 passengers branded one. They redo their home in bland white that looks great in cameras and lighting and everything. Shari is going through school and having her first crush. So Shari explains how she had a crush on this one guy who wasn't active in the church, and his family would not have been approved by her parents, and so she was trying to keep this a secret. I think his dad had tattoos or something. So she downloaded Snapchat to talk to this guy, and her parents found out and took her phone away, and then decided to take her out of school entirely. Yeah, because her crush's mom saw that Shari was using a laptop to talk to her crush. Shari was then put in Chad's school, and Chad was not happy about that because now Shari's on Chad's turf. Shari was already feeling like she wanted to not be on the planet anymore. She actually got the strength to tell her dad that she was depressed after she learned what depression was in a health class. Immediately, her dad was concerned. He was supportive of her, and he was like, would you like to do therapy? Green flags all the way around. And they would get through it together. Shari was extremely scared of her mom finding out, and when her mom did find out, she, 1, didn't care, and 2, thought she was faking for attention, and 3, didn't really let her go to therapy, but then when she did, she didn't even feel comfortable enough talking to the therapist. Jodi Hildebrandt. The answer for Chad's pranks in the beginning of the worst. Jodi Hildebrandt had a Connexions programs, a philosophy based on honesty, personal responsibility, humility, and she was terrible. She was easily seen to be upon Google search, where you could see that she was stripped of her clinical mental health counselor license. She was taken away for misconduct sharing personal information to the church that stripped a man of his dignity and his membership. You can see interviews where this man talks about how she really ruined his life, and he was really just, I don't know, she claimed that he was like pedophile or like predator. I don't know if I can say that. Really, he was just talking about his addiction and how he didn't want his addiction to impact his relationship. And God, I just hate this woman. It was clearly ethically and legally wrong. She decided to take to the internet instead, because what do you do when you lose your medical professional license? You feed the internet the exact same stuff that you want to feed your patients, but there's no regulation for if what you're saying is bullcrap. Chad was deemed demonically irresponsible and sent to Anasazi Foundation, a therapeutic and nature-based treatment program for adolescents aged 12 to 17. Residential treatment that takes a comprehensive approach, blah, 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 blah. Basically, abuse centers where children go missing all the time and are abused and are isolated and write letters home that are read and scrapped. And oh my God, like, these camps that, I don't know, apparently Reddit says that Anasazi is against the kidnapping where they wake up the child in the middle of the night and kidnap them and take them to a camp. Regardless, I do not think that kids should be going to these camps. I do not think that parents should be paying tens of thousands of dollars to send their irresponsible, immature children that don't follow the rules off to these camps. It ruins their relationship forever. It causes so much trauma, if not the death of their child. I don't want to get off on a tangent, but they send Chad to one of these camps that apparently should cure him of his pranks, and he comes back just the same guy. Honestly, he said he apparently had like a good time or something like that. I don't want to speak for Chad, but that's what I remember from this experience. That he didn't come back in a 360 personality alteration. Anyway, wilderness camps are abusive and cult-like most of the time, if not every single time. Chad comes back and he does therapy with Jodi Hildebrandt, and Shari does a quick little Google search and sees that Jodi accused a man of being a predator without proof, had her license suspended, and other opinions online about her being manipulative and bonkers. And when she shared this with Chad, her mother went to her and said, "What's wrong with you sabotaging your brother? You're the worst child ever." While Shari is sabotaging her brother, Ruby and Kevin pull Chad out of all the sports he enjoyed, every source of his joy actually, to better him as a child. And soon enough, Shari was also pulled out of track and told she wasn't being vulnerable enough with her mother as the reason why. She was threatened to be pulled out of school and have her phone taken away if she didn't go to therapy with Jodi Hildebrandt. So Shari started documenting her thoughts per Jodi's request when she started therapy with her. And she was not... Charlie, what are you doing? Oh, it's not Charlie. Charlie's asleep on the PlayStation. So Shari enters in reluctantly into these video calls with Jodi. Jodi's like, "I've heard you talking about me." Shari's like, "Oh, it's embarrassing to be like called out for that, right?" Jodi's like, "Well, here's what we'll do. We'll have you document your thoughts, follow up with them." She kind of like does a soft introduction into all her bonkers stuff, because while Shari goes into this very reluctant and knowing that people online say that this woman is manipulative, she has her license revoked, Shari ends up a devout Jodi follower. And then it's undone with a lot of hard work and critical thinking on Shari's part, because it is like a cult-like leader who manipulates you into believing there's things wrong with you. Oh gosh, it's so bad. Anyway, Jodi wants her to document her thoughts. She's like, "Okay, I discounted the positive feedback that I got on my essay. I also catastrophized about the upcoming presentation I have for school. So she's writing all these moments where she realizes that she's talking bad to herself. Things that like sound good in therapy, where you can like be more aware of what you're thinking and combating those negative thoughts about yourself. Weirdly enough, Jodi's telling her, "Okay, so instead of reassuring yourself that you will be okay and that you are smart," she tells her the opposite. Tell yourself you will fail. So Shari tells herself, "I will fail, I am awful," etc. And then she starts believing this, because self-talk to yourself reinforces this self-esteem. Like, I mean, just basic psychology, right? Shari starts losing her friends, starts judging her friends around her, parroting Jodi, and...
I couldn't find losing your friends in your Apple.
Okay. Shari's family moves into a new house. Now she's sleeping in different rooms, so she doesn't really have the comfort of her sister. So she's more isolated. And then Ruby made her biggest mistake of all, which was posting her children's neglect online. Like she hasn't been posting that recently, but she posts about how Chad has been sleeping on a beanbag for 6 months. And she's bragging about it. She's saying it with a smile, she's laughing. And even though Chad played it off, the internet became enraged, rightfully so. And soon enough, everyone was hating on 8 passengers. Everyone was calling Child Protective Services. Ruby left the channel up, but she was moving on to other things because it really was falling apart. Subscribers lost. But Ruby was already kind of on the Connexions bandwagon because Jodi hit it off with Ruby. Ruby bans TV in her household and electronics over the summer, and when Shari was finally proud of her progress in therapy and shared it with Jodi, she was like, wow, like I'm proud of myself, like I listened to what you said and it's working out. Jodi flipped and was like, that's not what you're supposed to do. And she straight up called Shari an obedient little drone. The house is under a no technology rule. Therapy continues. The obedient little drone. The next therapy session, Shari apologizes. And she's like, you're so right. I am an obedient little drone. God. Jodi says, you're saying I called you an obedient little drone? I would never call you that. And Shari's like, oh my God, what's going on right now? And Shari straight up goes back to her journal from a few days or whatever. And she's like, it says it right here. I'm not crazy. Jodi's trying to gaslight Shari and say, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Bro. Jodi also says that babies are greedy, and that the reason why they cry is because they are greedy and selfish and want attention, and you should not give it to them. Because it's against God. Or something, probably, because she's insane. Chapter 24, The Demon in My Room. Jodi starts making it a contract that her disciples, the people that are following Jodi's Connexions program, can't use any of the teachings in their content without giving Jodi money for it. And this is not good for Jodi because they're like, what? And now they're seeing through Jodi and seeing that her beliefs aren't some like godly divine relationship with God that has been shared about spirituality and being a good person and doing the Lord's work, but rather it's just a money grab. They start walking away except Ruby, and Jodi said she fired the ones that walked away when in reality they left because, you know, she sucks. This is at the point where Shari decides to rebel. And it starts with a friendship with Derek, her older neighbor, who's talking to her in a way that does not feel comfortable. And this is honestly part of the story that like breaks my heart the most. Of course, all of it is so heartbreaking. Shari's treatment of Shari led her to be so vulnerable to other abuse. And I mean, this is, I feel like, very common in situations of abuse, and especially with women. Gosh, I don't even want to think about it. But this is so sad. Okay, Ruby forbid this friendship with Derek, but this is really the only thing that Shari has to herself, so she kind of rebels. Derek is like mid-40s or something. He might be younger. I just know that he's an adult, okay? Jodi moves in 2 weeks before Shari is moving to college because she's not well. But Jodi keeps it a secret from the Connexions followers. So she's recording her videos, Ruby's recording her videos, but they make sure that their followers can't really see like, oh, is that Ruby's house? They make sure, because it'd be weird if 2 women were living in the same household. Why would they do that? Unless Jodi moves into Shari's room, and Shari realizes that something is going on with them because she said that Jodi would go into trances with visions of Ruby walking alongside Jesus. Jodi referred to these as pen papers when she documented them, including a lion named Charles that Jodi would ride. And this became apparently like divinely like reference thing on Reddit or something. She said that these pen papers would be elevated to the Holy Scripture. Kevin was not doing anything about this. He did not throw up a fuss when Ruby was like, oh, we need to move Jodi Hildebrandt into our house. And she needs to take Sherry's room. And she's having trances, so I really need to pay all my attention into this one woman that I met. Sorry, Kevin. Except she really doesn't say sorry. Charlie! One thing that I thought was interesting is Sherry mentions that Ruby and Jodi ate a lot of junk food. That they would just like go out and get ice cream all the time, and that Jodi had so much ranch dressing in the house, and that they would make shopping trips down to Mexico for pills that they would say were antibiotics that they were stocking up on for the apocalypse. I just think that's... Anyway, Ruby, Pam, this other woman in the Connexions circle, and Jodi were a squad, and Ruby had never been happier. And Ruby dictated where Kevin could go in the house. And when Jodi and Ruby started sharing a room, Kevin was allowed to leave whenever, but he could not come back without Ruby's express permission on when. Ruby tried to also sign over 8 passengers to Jodi, but the family lawyer was like, girl, what? And wouldn't let her do it. Sherry actually went to her bedroom one time to get something when they weren't there. Walks into the bedroom, candles lit everywhere, massage oils, vanilla and lavender in the air. She was freaked out. She states, the only thing missing was rose petals. Sherry takes a second here to mention about how the LDS community doesn't love queerness, but it's preached to love everyone, that Sherry wouldn't have minded so much about finding out if her mom was a lesbian or bisexual, so much if Ruby was honest about it. Rather, if they were engaged in a queer relationship, they were preaching that homosexuality was a sin. Yeah, she was talking about how they were being hypocritically queer, if so, because they say they adhere to spirit and truth. Chapter 27 was really hard. Sherry talked about how Derek took advantage of her in a panic and how she felt really ashamed of herself, that she felt like she was ruined forever. And Derek hastily takes control back by immediately texting her and really just sinking his claws in, using his insecurity as a way for Sherry to feel like she has to, you know, pacify him at the same time as disregarding her own feelings. It's just awful. It's just awful. Chapter 28, the semester was halfway over. So Sherry goes home. She has to get permission to go into her room. And she's like, are you kidding me? And Kevin's like, that's just the way things are now. She's kind of disappointed in that. She's disappointed in Kevin. And it's Thanksgiving, and she does not want to spend Thanksgiving with Jodi, so she goes to her grandparents' house. When she does, it kind of seems like her grandparents can tell that she's not in, like, the best of spirits, but she obviously doesn't want to share about everything that's going on in the household, but they do share a moment where they're, you know, there for each other. Chapter 29, Jingle Hell. Ruby's very, very, very happy. They're officially sharing the room together, and Kevin's alone in his room. Nice. Ruby tells Sherry that he and Jodi will have dinner with Sherry at 7 p.m. They do not come down. Time goes by. Sherry makes food for herself and her siblings, and then Ruby and Jodi come down an hour later, and they're like, why did you make food? We were going to go out and eat with you. And Sherry's like, are you kidding me? Like, Sherry is fed up. She's fed up. Ruby says, your poor future husband, Sherry. And if there is one phrase that Ruby loves to throw in Sherry's face, it is your poor future husband, because she knows that Sherry wants to be married one day. And what hurts more than hearing from your mother that you are unworthy of love? Yeah, Ruby and Jodi went to dinner themselves, and then they come back and they're sobbing. At least Jodi's sobbing, and Sherry's like, what is going on here? She shares that the moment that Ruby and Sherry were arguing reminded Jodi of how her daughter left her. And then Sherry immediately started feeling bad about the argument that they had and felt like she was going to be losing her mom forever if she keeps up this distance from her mother. So she hugs her mom, and it's like so terrible that, like, you know, she feels this guilt is being mistreated by her mom. We have the worst Christmas ever. The two youngest siblings need to be taught not to be entitled, even though they're like 10, below 10. So they're not getting any presents while the other children get presents. It's said that children are not entitled to a magical childhood. And if there's one thing that I think children are entitled to, it is a magical childhood. Like, you grow up in taxes, you deserve a magical childhood. Ruby said that Jodi is miraculously healed and returning to her house. Shari's hoping that this separation will give her family what it needs to heal. That Ruby and Kevin will finally come together. The children won't have to go another Christmas without Christmas presents. And that Shari can finally go in her room without permission. Derek, God, I'm so angry. I'm so angry. Derek convinces Shari that she needs to be trained to have experience for when she gets married. Shari agrees to share her location with him. He messages her nonstop. She is extremely depressed and desperate for a fatherly figure that she kind of gets from Derek. And so she isolates herself. She's skittish. She starts quitting the clubs that she's in college. And she even starts avoiding people in case that they question, you know, why is Derek talking to you so much? Why are you seeing this guy that's older than you? This guy might have even had a wife. I mean, she's in denial, and she's lost. You know, she doesn't have the support system that should be there for her. She would come very close to cutting things off with him, but then she's afraid because he knows where she lives. Gosh, it's just awful. She finally tells Derek that she's uncomfortable, that what they're doing isn't right, and it would be awful for everyone if it became public. He says that he's an elder of Melchizedek priesthood and wouldn't do anything to jeopardize his calling. Shari's desperate, so she calls her mother. In a moment of vulnerability, tells her mother that she doesn't feel like loves Shari and that she prioritizes Jodi. Says that, you know, she never really checks on Shari. And her mother invites her to come talk to her about it, but in a condescending way, saying that Shari's selfish in her text and her motivations, and that she's hiding something from her, which partly is true. But wow, what a good opening to, oh, I don't think you love me. You're selfish. So she wants to tell her mom, but she also wants to know that her mom cares more than anything, and she fails. She doesn't tell her mom. Ruby then invited her to pay for the dinner that she just invited Shari to. She was like, are you kidding me? She's learning about abuse of power in her classes, but she can't apply them in her own life because she's in survival mode. Shari's bishop suggests that she get therapy, and she says, well, my mom won't do that. And the bishop actually tells her, actually, the church will pay for it. She's like, really? So she opens up about her family life in therapy, and the therapist tells her she's a victim of emotional abuse. At the time, she slightly mentions Derek as like a father figure present in her life, and she's shameful, so she avoids talking about the rest, but she at least feels relieved, but she also feels guilty about not sharing more. Frankie's all come together for a photo shoot, and Ruby says she doesn't want the dog in the picture, and thankfully they put the dog in the picture because the dog is literally part of the family. And Ruby refuses to kiss Kevin in front of everyone. They were originally going to go to a Wasatch mountain trip because they do one every year with the family, but they exclude Chad and the two youngest siblings. That's like almost half of them. And then Shari refuses to go because she has classes. And she becomes the one that's asked to watch the kids. She immediately says yes because she cares about the kids. And Ruby and Kevin agree to help Shari pay with gas. Charlie! We need a break. Charlie's here to give everyone a beautiful little break. He's so precious and so baby. So they agree to help Shari with gas until the days leading up to it. And then they're like, that's selfish of you. Like, she's more shocked that Kevin is speaking to her in this way because she's used to it from Ruby. But she's like, Kevin has never talked to me like this before. So she's just all sorts of frazzled. Meanwhile, her father is divulging his sins every week, like Jodi's nibbling had to. Because when Jodi's nibbling Jessie was sharing... Whoops. Jodi would force them in a room and force them to divulge their sins as a 14-year-old, maybe even less than that, being like, how many boys have you kissed? And they're like, I haven't kissed any boys. I don't even think about kissing boys. And Jodi's like, no, tell me everything. And they end up making up stuff because they're like, I just want to get out of here, you know? Oh my God, it's just awful. So basically every single tiny little thing, Kevin is basically wondering, oh, maybe there's something evil in this one action I did. Kevin mentions a memory of giving Shari ice cream one night under a table when Shari was given chicken Alfredo, which she had grown a hatred for at a young age. And it was a moment of like bonding for Shari and Kevin. Shari was heading out of the table, he slid it to her, that way she wouldn't go to bed hungry. And Jodi used that against Kevin, as well as Kevin talking to a female coworker and noticing that a woman in a gym was attractive. Jodi sees sex in every single interaction, demonizing every single interaction, obsessed with it. Also reflective in her conversations with Jesse. This crazy dude. Like, she shouldn't be obsessing over her nibbling sins as a child. It's just weird. It's just wrong. Jodi turned hugging his daughters into a perversion and convinced him of this perversion, that he is wrong, that hugging your daughters is wrong. And of course, Kevin became horrified at this thought, as anyone would, and thought he was corrupted for this normal interaction because Jodi's insane. And it was only a matter of time before he was invited to leave the family to protect his family because of his perversion. And of course he's going to say yes, because he's literally in a cult where he is thinking that he's a danger to his daughters. God, it's just awful. Of course, Jodi is the danger to his daughters. It says that in her time in college, she becomes close with a professor that had shown some care for her, so she becomes very close to the Haymans. The professor and his wife have a daughter her age, and the wife presented her with a key to their house, that way she could over when she needed to, because she knew that Shari's home life wasn't very supportive. But one time she did, and then Kevin called and told Shari that he and Chad will be leaving because they're selfish and they'll be gone for a year. Shari is of course confused. He's angry that he's abandoning the kids. Kevin says he will only be contacting Shari and no one else. Then when Shari wakes up after this terrible news, Kevin says, don't be selfish or resentful for this, but I actually won't be in contact with you. So Shari is obviously grieving for a few days. She gets a message from her mom asking how she is. And Shari's kind of shocked. Wow, okay, great mom. But then her mom says, I hope you use this as an opportunity to be more humble. Ruby asks Shari to have lunch with her, and Shari declines, good for her, saying that she can do text. Her mom says, well, texting leaves room open for misinterpretation. So Shari uses this time to think about Kevin's role in basically everything, coming to the conclusion that he was so selfless that he played into Ruby's ruse, that she knew he wouldn't be invited back after a year because Ruby would rather forget about him. Shari moves into her own apartment, one with a few other girls in her college, just to find out that it has black mold. She calls her mom, which is an obvious mistake because Ruby answers saying, you're an adult now, Shari, you need to figure it out yourself. Shari doesn't talk about Derek or how she found out that Chad was not living with her dad as she thought it would be. So she thought that Chad and Kevin would be living together while they're living separate from the rest of the family. But no, Chad is living in his own apartment with some other boys, other roommates in an apartment complex. She's worried about this. So she messages the landlord, and the landlord says, I cannot share information because of privacy and everything. But she receives a random message with the address of the complex. So she packs a letter and snacks that she knows that Chad really loves. She wants to go there and leave this letter and snacks when her brother isn't there. But, she wants to show her brother, we are still connected. Like, I hope you're okay. I have no idea what's going on. But she gets there and Chad is actually there. His roommate opens the door. Chad's suspicious and unwelcoming, asking, why is she there? Shari said, misses him. Their family is falling apart. Ruby's abusive. And he's like, you need to worry about yourself, Shari. Worry about your own responsibilities. And so Shari leaves with the care package and she's glad he's okay, but She's emotionally drained because his demeanor towards her is not friendly at all. Chad actually must have texted Ruby because Ruby warps Shari's visit as a malicious attack. Sabotage, stating that she can't call Ruby abusive and get the reward of connection to family. So Shari's getting the disconnection that she wants. Ruby says she's open to communication when Shari's more humble, but that she is a very lost soul. So Shari packed her bags and goes to the Haymans. Derek keeps texting her. Derek hates that she's at the Haymans, probably because they're an actually good support system for her and a threat to her reliance on him. He keeps telling her that she's a burden on them. And of course, she's going to believe this. She becomes hesitant on her comfort in the home. Her therapist brought up trauma responses and fawning, and Shari starts recognizing that is her behavior with Derek. And when she blurts that out, she's like, oh no, I didn't mean to say that's my behavior with Derek. And the therapist is like, is this the guy you mentioned before? And Shari feels some relief that she accidentally let that slip. And she knows she needs to make progress on leaving Derek behind because she's in a pattern of abuse where she just fawns to survive. But she just doesn't have enough in her yet to do so and feel safe. She decides to transfer her own money into her bank account after her mom says no access to the family. She knew that Ruby was going to retaliate. It's a good thing she did transfer her money over because the family insurance agent sends Shari a message the next day saying, you're no longer on Ruby's car insurance policy and you cannot drive until you get your own insurance. She freaks out because the title to her car is at Ruby's house. She puts Ruby in a text thread with the president of the congregation so that she has some sense of safety. And the mother writes, I would have obviously given you the title to you if you didn't add the president in the conversation. It's just another way you're manipulating me, Shari. Another way of being ungodly. And you can get the title from Pam. So neighbors told Shari that the kids had been alone for 5 days while Ruby and Jodi were off somewhere. So Shari calls Child Protective Services to see if they're okay. Like, she gets a wellness check on them. So they are okay, but they're alone. And she's like, great. Now that I called them, Ruby's gonna make it even harder to get my title, probably. Reddit explodes because they find out that Kevin and Chad weren't living with the family anymore. And so Shari texts an Instagram story saying, yes, the family's disconnected, but please respect our privacy right now. And that she is healing, hopefully that the family will reunite soon. She asks Miss Heyman to go with her to get her documents, and when Pam opens the door, Ruby is there waiting to ambush her. She's like, I'll give you the documents after we have a talk. So Shari refuses to go inside, and Ruby's like, you've planted rumors about me, and you're not part of our family anymore. You're a Judas and a betrayer for calling the police. And Shari's like, I was protecting the kids. And Ruby's like, you're playing and being an adult. Ruby gives her her documents. Miss Heyman steps in and Ruby asks, one more thing. Will you promise not to talk about us like you did on Instagram? And Shari's like, no. And good for her. That is the last conversation she had with her mother. Thank God for Miss Heyman. I'm so glad that Miss Heyman went with her. This is where Shari talks about how she's missing having a mom and dad, and she asks the Heymans if she can call them mom and dad, and they're like, of course. Kevin doesn't answer her birthday text. She receives lots of messages from concerned fans, but doesn't know how to respond. Connexions is actually gaining traction. Lovely. It's ironic because Jodi's son and daughter literally cut her out of their lives, and now you have a Ruby's estranged children, and then the other children she has, of course, she's keeping in isolation, abusing. And meanwhile, Jodi is presented as a savior and a deity. Almost. So the neighbor calls Shari and says, Ruby pulled the kids out of school. Thank God for this neighbor. I mean, it's not really said that like the neighbors like really help a lot with child safety, but at least they are keeping Shari in the know. Another neighbor calls and says that they got rid of the dog. It's because she doesn't want the kids to go outside. And they have to go outside if they walk the dog. Awful. Shari calls DCFS again and recounts the childhood abuse to a forensic psychologist. But DCFS says that they have no evidence of physical abuse, but that they'd still try to go to a judge and try to get the kids out of there. Kelly is the worker, and she calls again a month later, or a month and a half later or something, and says that they have to close the case because there's just not enough evidence to investigate for neglect. All right, so Shari is on campus, and since her father is a professor, she accidentally locks eyes with her dad since he teaches there. And he has a strange smile and goes away, and wow, does that hurt, right? She gets a call from her neighbor that Ruby's packing up the house and selling all their stuff and is moving somewhere. She assumes to Jodi's house in Ivan's, where no one will know where the kids are, basically. Shari immediately asks Mr. Hammond to go with her to get her things before Shari sells all of them. She requests via email to Ruby and is ghosted. So she gets to the house, there's no car. She squeezes through the doggy door and is reminded that it would have been her parents' anniversary 22 years that year. Shari's Aunt Julie sends her a DM that they've moved to Provo nearby and is thinking of her and says that they should get dinner sometime. So they meet for dinner and Ruby's other sisters are there and they kind of have a discussion about Ruby and Jodi. She kind of feels closer to Julie after this. And Shari says that she really starts watching true crime shows and sees a girl getting isolated and stalked by a man. And she realizes that it's kind of a parallel to her relationship with Derek. Guess what Charlie did?
What did you do?
Attacked the camera strap, so my camera doesn't have a camera strap anymore.
So to the top.
Alright, now we have our peppermint tea with honey. I don't need all of these. What if, in my next video, I use these as the characters? What if that becomes the next YouTube trend? What if I start it, where I cast all the characters as Pokemon?
Yeah. Yeah, I knew what you meant.
Elspeth
But
came
that's
over
just what
here,
I thought.
and she was like, I don't like you.
It might catch on. It's like Luann's.
I don't know.
You remember Luann's Manger Babies
I don't know what that is.
from King of the Hill?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, she had little puppets.
That's so funny.
That's gonna be you.
We'll see. All right, back to your regularly programmed schedule.
Regularly scheduled program.
Back to your regularly... Wait. Am I in frame?
Starlax isn't in frame.
That's okay.
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 Oh yeah,
thanks.
you're just sitting on them. Duh.
Okay. All right, so Shari was watching true crime shows. She saw herself in the victim. He had, at one point, said that he could show her how to defend herself and that he would come to her campus disguised and attack her to see if she was paying enough attention. So to her, that was a reminder that he could do anything he wanted at any given time. She had to be fawning over him all the time. She thought of how she needed her dad and then woke up in a start crying. Decided she would tell her bishop about Derek. She texted him and texted Julie asking if Julie would come over. She left her phone at her house. Remember, Derek's tracking her phone, and told Julie and the bishop about it. So Derek had so many missed messages when she checked her phone. Finally texted him, said like, well, I was at my aunt's house. He's like, no, you weren't. And she's like, well, I forgot my phone. He asked if she was upset because it was her birthday in a few days and she doesn't have anyone to spend it with. Basically says he'll take her to dinner. And she doesn't respond, but then when his car pulls up to her aunt's house, he leaves a bunch of gifts by Shari's car. And she's like, WTF? Her aunts are like, a married man old enough to be your father is doing stuff like this? Shari's like, don't worry, don't talk to him. I'll end it. And she goes back to her shared apartment, breaks down, confesses to her roommate how she sinned and all this stuff. And she said that she'd probably get her temple recommend taken away. Basically, like, it's like a good standing temple membership, kind of. I'm sure that was a poor explanation of it. I'm sorry. Decides to text him. She says they'll need to be very cautious, lock the doors, keep the blinds up. And so she texts Derek that it's over. He's like, wow, so I was right. You never cared for me. And she's like, that's not true. But he says, fine. And she blocks him. She gets on a Zoom call with her bishop and tells him, and he says that she was put in a situation that no young person should be in. So that normally she would lose her temple reserve, but he would see what he could do for her because he has to give the president a call. He suggests that she should probably take a break from the temple. And she's like, yep, I'm probably gonna lose my temple recommend. And unfortunately, she does. Derek starts emailing her saying, I'm sorry I hurt you. I hope you can forgive me. I need you. You need me. I'm so desperate. She blocks him and he makes more email addresses and more. And then his son's number starts sending her messages. His truck drove by her apartment and he denied everything. His bishop believed him and Shari had deleted all of her texts and the emails from him. So, of course, they're going to leave the man in power. So she obviously loses her faith and trust in the establishment when she got her recommend back because these two men had brushed her experience under the rug to protect their friend. So she ended up changing her ward and decided only to trust in God and not anyone specifically in her church. So she finally told Kevin's parents, her grandparents, what was going on with the family and how it was separated. They hadn't even heard from Kevin in forever. There's a free-range parenting law in Utah that ties DFCS's hands because when it comes to neglect, because it encourages independence in children, it encourages them walking to school or unsupervised, bless you, time or whatever. When it comes to rhetoric that Jodi was using in the videos, it was becoming increasingly concerning because this might be a direct quote. If your child comes to you on fire, you don't pat them on the head and say, it's okay, I'll help you. No, you beat them and you kick them and you hit them with a rod. So, yeah. June 2023, Kevin abruptly abandoned his professor position at BYU. Shari was sad because he was doing great work to help the earthquake research and keeping people safe. While he was keeping other people safe, he couldn't really keep his own family safe. And then Shari actually had to find a new place to live because 2 months before cutting it off with Derek, she had found a new place, but she had to have somebody co-sign for it. And since her relationship with her parents were so bad, she had Derek co-sign for it. She was about to move from one apartment to another one where Derek knows where she lives. Luckily, she was able to cancel the lease and find a new apartment. She ended up moving in last minute with some other people. They were watching a true crime documentary about an LDS couple, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell. Chad's former wife died under suspicious circumstances, and so did Lori's husband. Then their children went missing. They were engaged in extreme beliefs, like Jodi and Ruby, about doomsday, including Tom Harrison's visions of glory prophecies. Shari was having the darkest thoughts yet about the state of her family. She was wondering if it was too late for her siblings. She said with medication therapy and with the shame and guilt lifting away from her, free from Derek, she was finding strength from within herself and away from the blind trust in authority. She wouldn't stop calling DCFS and leaving food at the children's house in case they were hungry, and her neighbors were there with her. Her neighbor then called her on August 30th, 2023 and said, Shari, the police are at your mother's house. So now we are back to the very beginning of the book where it said that she showed up to her mother's house with the police, where they had a battering ram, they're searching for children, and no one was home. So the 8 passengers' car was in the lot, and Shari was in a room with the detective that day and learned that her siblings were actually in the house of Jodi and were now safe in custody. Jodi and Ruby was arrested, Jodi first and then Ruby upon her arrival back at Jodi's house, that they were both charged with aggravated child abuse, meaning a pattern of cruelty, confinement, extreme neglect, or intentional infliction of harm on a child. Shari went home and cried and slept in peace, knowing that they were out of harm's way and that Jodi and Ruby would never touch her siblings again. Upon arrest, Ruby said nothing, and Jodi played the victim in misunderstanding route. You can actually watch the footage online. I had watched the footage when it came out, and yeah. Charlie! Stop it! Shari didn't exactly know what had happened yet, and Chad was the only child that wasn't taken into custody. Ruby and Jodi were transferred from St. George to Purgatory Correctional Facility, which is aptly named, and ironic. Charlie! It would be revealed to Kevin that Ruby sat in the car with Jodi in 15 minutes of silence. Interesting. Kevin was brought in for questioning, but was relaying brainwashed rhetoric.
Baby.
So Kevin was brought in for questioning, but was relaying brainwashed rhetoric, like the separation from us has been very, very good to me to address my addictions, etc. But says he hasn't been aware of anything that's been going on. That randomly Ruby called him to pick up the kids that day, right before she was arrested, but he didn't know why. 5 days before was the last time he saw Ruby, when she said she wanted him to sign over titles to her, titles of the car, and what he didn't know is that she wanted to sell the house but couldn't because the mortgage was in his name. Kevin confessed he would have signed anything Ruby put in front of him. Luckily, she was arrested before that could happen. Kevin was confused for why he was brought in, and once told, painted a picture of what had happened. He was shocked and disgusted, and then was told his children were in DCFS custody, and he became emotional, asking what was going to happen to his wife, that he loved his wife. Ruby spoke and said that she's misunderstood by her family, Jodi's misunderstood, and she compares herself to Joseph Smith, how she was going on about how in 10 days she would probably be released from jail. And she said that God spoke to her when she was driving before she called Kevin, when she kind of knew that she was going to be arrested, that God had told her, your children are going to be removed. So Ruby was convinced the children were perfectly fine, saying, I don't understand why they're in the hospital. Shari goes back to the house to get items that weren't confiscated originally by the police, including journals, electronic devices, and trinkets, specifically the brooch that Kevin had got her when he went to Italy. She wanted to give it to her children. She went accompanied by an officer. Weirdly enough, Kevin wanted to sue her. I'm sure if you're familiar with the topic, you saw that. Shari figured out the passwords for Ruby's laptop and opened her emails, and it confirmed there was a relationship between Jodi and Ruby. Ruby was expressing frustration for Jodi's needs, physical affection, but not really getting any in return. Shari's shocked that her mother was doing anything in service of Jodi. She was really shocked that she was doing anything in service for another person. Shari had the opportunity to read on and see more of what was going on, but she didn't want to, so she didn't. She did look in her parents' bedroom, and she said it was like nothing had changed. The only thing that was different was that Ruby had left her rings on the counter. She left the engagement ring 1 and 2, and Shari reflected on if the relationship was always one-sided. That Kevin loved her so much and Ruby was incapable, and Shari thinks about how she feels like a child that was born out of false love. Shari actually slips the rings on her fingers and makes a promise not to forget what Ruby did, that keeping the rings wouldn't be a memento, but rather a reminder of the truth. And her father was still ill in Shari's mind, as he threatened to sue her, like I said, or sue the police for letting her retrieve the items, even though she had rights for them. And then Ruby was loyal to Jodi at first, but then changed her tune in the courts when she realized that she could paint herself as a victim of Jodi's and plead guilty and testify against her. So, guilty plea of 4 counts of aggravated child abuse with consecutive sentencing meant a maximum of 30 years under Utah law, but as little as 4 years. Following, Shari experienced an emotional storm out of nowhere. Most of it was guilt and self-loathing towards her involvement with Derek, since that she was a bad person, a homewrecker, and was really questioning her will to live. She was unpacking this with her therapist and how it makes sense that she would need a long time to unpack the 2 years that her dynamic with Derek developed before addressing the conditioning and complex emotions that came with Ruby's upbringing. She thought that once Ruby's reign ended that everything would be okay, but now she had to deal with the aftermath of vulnerable state that Ruby put her into in the first place. December 2023, Ruby called Chad from prison, and it just so happened to be that Shari was there with him when she called. She was desperately searching for meaning through scripture, recalling a passage where Jesus drank from a bitter cup, saying she was drinking hers now, comparing herself to Jesus and to Joseph Smith again. But in public, she was proclaiming that her intervention with the police was a blessing, that it brought her clarity, and that her time away from Jodi was enlightening. But regardless of how much of a victim she actually was to Jodi, she still caused extreme harm to the children and clearly needs psychological help. Shari takes this moment to talk about narcissistic disorder. Shari compiled videos that showed Ruby's strict discipline before Jodi came on the scene and asked people on Instagram to contribute to a Google document with all of the videos, because it was going to be so hard for Shari to look through all of these videos, especially of your own family. It would be extremely overwhelming. Ruby and Jodi's wacky and dangerous manifesto was there in the Connection videos themselves. Ruby wrote to Kevin fearful of prison, saying that she was scared of being shanked, most likely because being among prisoners, you're basically the worst of the worst if you're a child abuser. And Shari was experiencing both fear for her mother, but also justice. yeah, she claims that, you know, Ruby did that to herself. So Kevin moved back into the house and was sleeping alone in the bedroom, going through therapy just as Shari was. He was focused on making the home a home again before delving into much else, focused on repairing his relationship with his children. Kevin needed to prove to the authorities that he was responsible for their welfare, and he started to get 2 new puppies, a Cavapoo named Rin and a Bernedoodle named Stimpy. He cleared out the pantry, which was kind of symbolic because of the way that they always had the pantry. But told them that they can decorate their rooms, however, even have TVs in each one, whatever they want. They were spending Christmas alone, 2 out of 7, and Kevin goes, I've always wanted a cat. So Shari, who was living at a 1-bedroom apartment alone for her last year of college, she went over, and then they went over together and both got themselves each a cat. So she got a cat named Muppet, and then he got one named Katniss. And now that she was a cat mom, and she found it impossible to understand what Ruby and Jodi meant about the dangers of prioritizing your children over your needs. February 20th, 2024 was the day of Ruby's sentencing. Shari went the 4-hour drive to St. George with Chad and Kevin. Kevin and Shari discussed while Chad was on his phone about how Jodi had listed her home for $5.3 million on the market, probably hoping for assets before they were seized by the courts. And Shari's lawyer was working on a restraining order that would forbid her to liquidate her assets before they could be allocated to the children in health, treatment, and support. Shari was anxiously expecting a media barrage, but was pleasantly surprised until she walked in the courtroom and realized that there weren't any cameras outside of the courtroom because they were all inside the courtroom. Ruby walked in, and Shari was absolutely disgusted, couldn't find it in her to look at Ruby at all. Then, as you can watch online, Ruby launches into an insane thank you Grammy speech where she thanks every single person responsible for her arrest and more, simply saying that they saved her from a trapped mental state and a nightmare, and she just became free once she was put in shackles. So that's crazy. And then she turns to Kevin and declares him the love of her life. Poor Kevin's shoulders start shaking. She addresses her 6 chicks. Says that she was swept in a current, that she was supposed to keep them safe. And it just doesn't really read, I don't know, it doesn't read genuine in my opinion. I don't know. She doesn't really take any responsibility for her actions before Jodi. Shari reimagines a play that she put on with her siblings of Frozen when she was younger. Like how Elsa built her ice castle and comes back down transformed. She pictures that Ruby will do the same, but then comes back into reality thinking, okay, that's just wishful thinking. Ruby's given 4 sentences to 4 to 15 years in prison to be served consecutively. Shari says that she grabs Kevin's hand and that she decided to forgive him as Jesus preaches, even though that she can't condone his enabling and the ignoring of mounting abuse. Jodi, 2 sides to every story. That's what she says. And she says, God speaks directly to me, and she's still making phone calls to her clients in prison, saying she's wrongfully persecuted and she loves the children. And she straight up says that in court. She says that she loves the children and she cares for the children. And it's just so wrong. Journals of Ruby's were released on the internet to the public, and they describe the awful abuse towards the children and the illusion of godliness and driving out demons. Shari says she didn't want to see the abuse or think about it, that she could already imagine the awful things that had happened herself. Then 2020 Vision came out with a documentary, and Shari, Chad, and Kevin went. That way they could have at least a little control over the narrative since it was running wild without their input. The documentary people flagged the abuse on screen. And Shari says that she didn't even like the portrayal of it, that it lacked empathy, that it was dramatized. She talks a little bit about she doesn't want to share her siblings' story, that if they want to in the future, then they can, but that she wants to give them as much privacy and control that they can, that she doesn't want to be anything like Ruby. This is where she really goes into narcissism and true narcissistic personality disorder. And while she doesn't really come straight out and say that she thinks that Ruby is a narcissist, she does talk about the behavior that is narcissistic behavior, and that she thinks that Ruby probably having to grow up feeling like she's perfect, a need to be exalted. Maybe it's because of Ruby's childhood that she behaved that way, that she had to be perfect and good to be exalted, and that security from that reflected in the conflict that most people with narcissistic personality disorder experience. Shari also comments on the true crime culture, which I think is important because she talks about how a lot of times it's so separate from reality and from the people's lives that have been impacted by these tragedies, that it becomes more of a spectacle and less of more of an entertainment cash grab for some people. It reminds people that her siblings are real people and that their lives have had this real tragedy occur. I can only imagine, especially with the cameras, having people theorize their own opinions about what's happening in real time, especially on children. The book ends talking about what happened like a year later. The new bishop updated her on how Derek had lost his position of power but not his temple recommend, which was even more confirmation to Shari that she needed to trust in God and less in the people that say that they had been appointed by God. She took down her YouTube channel, privated it for herself, went to meet all 7 of the 7 passengers for dinner at their home, and received a letter from Ruby. And the letter from Ruby was 5 pages long, half of which expressed the nostalgia and reminiscing on Ruby going to pick out colors for the bedroom walls for her first child, Shari, and picking out everything in preparation of having a child. There was no apology or reflection of her behavior towards her children. Rather, Ruby had wished she spent more time with Shari before her arrest. That's how the memoir ends. Shari, I think, posted a photo of her engagement ring about how she's engaged, and I really wish her the most happiness and her family the healing. This is just a terrible story, and Ruby and Jodi are so evil. I'm really glad that Shari spoke out and is advocating for restrictions on family vlogging. Family vlogging is dangerous. Can't consent to putting themselves out on the internet into the dangers and the cruelty that comes with it, and it can really be abusive, especially when other ideologies are involved. I think it's important that Shari talked about religious extremism, about manipulation, how people in power can abuse people and use religion to do so, and that she still retains her faith. I don't know. I think it was a wonderful memoir, and I'm really glad to have read it. This was heavy, and oh my gosh, literally 2 heavy books in a row. Not amazing, but both the books were great. I am pledging to read an actual fun novel next. I might tell you about what I've read. I've read some manga, I've read some heavy metal, I've read some anime, essay, I've read sapphic romance thriller. You will see some more videos. I will leave you there. I have a Patreon that you can join. I have a new member, and this member is a Chaos Lord. So Eric, thank you for your membership. If you are a Chaos Lord, you get your name at the end of my videos. So thank you for your support. And that's gonna be all for me. Hope you have a great day. See you later. Hi. So I was literally about to upload my video when I saw that some information came out recently. Okay, so about family vlogging, there were some protections that were put in place in Illinois. Apparently that was the first state to pass a law regarding it, with the financial interests in mind with the children. And that was back in last year, 2024. But California has a new child protection law that went into effect the first of this year. So it protects minors who are involved in creating digital content, and it says that 65% of their earnings should go to the child in a trust, and that 30% of their content must do that. That's okay. It could be better. I think Minnesota also, and they're just, meant to protect children from exploitation. But that's going on. Apparently some Californian family vloggers have moved out to Tennessee to avoid that, but whatever. And Good Morning America just had Kevin and Chad featured, and they were there talking with the director of a Hulu docuseries that released literally today, Thursday. This video might release on Friday, but you can watch The Devil in the Family today on Hulu. And unfortunately, I don't have a Hulu subscription anymore, but I don't really need to watch it right now. Kevin spoke at the Utah State House. He was speaking with Shari's words, speaking about the dangers of family vlogging, and Kevin spoke a little bit as well about how he loves Ruby and that he will probably always love Ruby, but that it still doesn't excuse what she did, and that he really regrets his decision in listening to the counsel of Jodi and Ruby because he believed that they had the best interests for the family in mind. I hope that their family is doing well and that family vlogging is restricted, because We need to protect the children. For realsies, okay? And that is the end for real.